Hello everyone, welcome to Dnandip. In this UPSC Simplified series, we will discuss one more previous year question from geography. In this question, we have to answer the variability of monsoon. So let us read what this question exactly says. So this question reads, what characteristics can be assigned to monsoon climate that succeeds in feeding more than 50% of the world population residing in monsoon area or monsoon Asia? Now, when it comes to the locus of this particular question, locus is definitely monsoon, and what part we need to focus is the characteristic of this particular event. Now, if you read this particular question, there are a lot of not necessary things which have been mentioned, like what characteristic can be assigned to monsoon climate that succeeds in feeding more than 50% of the world population residing in monsoon Asia. Now, if you read this question, just look at this part. Even if I do not mention this particular part, my answer remains unchanged, or hardly one or two line will change and rest of the part will remain the same. So essentially in this particular question, we have to address the characteristic of monsoon or monsoon climate. Now there can be a debate, are we supposed to only discuss monsoon or we are supposed to discuss monsoon climate? But for the general studies perspective, I'm not going to differentiate much between the monsoon phenomena or monsoon type of climate. By and large, both are the same. So whenever we have to address the characteristic of monsoon, we have to address the characteristic of whenever we have to ask on the characteristic of monsoon climate, it is nothing but characteristic of monsoon. Fine. Now we have defined the locus and focus of the question. When it comes to the body part of the question, let us discuss the body part of the question. In characteristic, there are many characteristics. I generally prefer to call it as variation in monsoon. So whatever characteristic we find, these characteristics can be discussed in the form of variations which we find in the monsoon, or you can also directly mention all these characteristics. So whatever characteristics you can read here: onset and withdrawal of monsoon, break and burst of monsoon. Then there is something called as monsoon intraseasonal phenomena. Then you can also mention some ENSO and its effect on this particular monsoon phenomena. There is spatial variation, which is also a characteristic that you will say that in the western part and in the eastern part, how monsoon varies, so on and so forth. So these are the characteristics anyway, right? Now these characteristics have been put in terms of variation, right? So you can do it anyway, both will be perfect. I'm just making it more technical or more scientific or more structured part. Now when I'm talking about characteristic, the very first part will be its temporal characteristics or temporal variation. So what I'm trying to say here, I'm trying to say with time how its characteristics change, or what all features it reflects with changing time. Now throughout the 4 months of monsoon, the monsoon rainfall does not remain the same. That is one simple characteristic of monsoon, right? That is nothing but temporal variation in the monsoonal rainfall or monsoonal climate. Now, when I am saying temporal variation or temporal characteristic of monsoon, the first temporal characteristic I am mentioning will be onset and withdrawal of monsoon. So you will mention that how gradually there is a onset of monsoon, first in the southern part or southern tip of the peninsula, and from southern tip of the peninsula gradually monsoon progresses towards the north, right? And you'll also mention dates. If you are able to recall, by 1st of June monsoon reaches to the southern tip of peninsula, and by 15th of July it has taken over on the most of the parts of the India. Now during the whole process it will rain obviously, but as we move towards September, generally we will talk about 17 September again. If you are able to recall the date, By 17th September, what happens? That this monsoon starts to withdraw. And again, this withdrawal happens in a phased manner, step by step manner. So that is also one characteristic of monsoon you have to mention, that onset takes step by step, because not all of a sudden monsoon activation we find all across India. So first it gets activated in the southern part and gradually it gets activated in the northern part, right? Similarly, it gets deactivated or it gets withdrawn in the northern parts first, and gradual withdrawal is completed by somewhere by mid of October. So that is first temporal characteristic, onset and withdrawal, which is in a phased manner. Then there is another characteristic, that is break and burst of monsoon, right? So you will say that there are certain phases, certain spells in which it rains a lot. There will be copious amount of rainfall, which are called as active phase of monsoon. That is nothing but burst of monsoon you are likely to mention. And in burst, you will also say that the activation of monsoon is a sudden phenomenon, right? There is like, you'll never find that rainfall is increasing gradually. That is never going to happen. What happens is, there will be onset of rainfall or onset of monsoon, and within a week you will find that there will be some days, some phases or some spell of monsoon, maybe a 10 or 15 days time period, it rains a lot. There is a copious amount of rainfall in the peninsular part, or be it in the Gangetic plains of India, right? Now, that is the burst of monsoon. Then you will say in characteristic, there is a break of monsoon. This is a very distinguishable characteristic or very particular characteristic we attribute to Indian monsoon or monsoon type of climate. Now, when it comes to the monsoon type of climate or monsoon rainfall, not all throughout 4 months it rains equally. You must have witnessed in the month of August or even now in extended September, monsoon is in a break phase. This is a prolonged break phase we are facing. Maybe after 5-10 years or almost 8 to 10 years, it is being said that we are facing such a break in monsoon. So that is a distinguishable characteristic. Now, what happens during the break phase of monsoon? During break phase of monsoon, monsoon becomes dormant. Now, we are not saying that monsoon has been withdrawn. We are suggesting that it is not active. There is not much of a rainfall which is taking place in this particular case. So this is a character, break and burst. Now, in this character, you can also mention some meso-like phenomena, monsoon intra-seasonal oscillation. So what do we have when it comes to monsoon intra-seasonal oscillation? In this particular characteristic, you will mention that there will be certain spells in which there is a lot of rainfall which is taking place and on the southern edges of the Himalayas, but there is no rainfall or no monsoonal activity we find in the either Gangetic plain or the peninsular region. So that is what monsoon intra-seasonal oscillation we have to mention in this particular character. Now, this was about the temporal characteristics or temporal variations of monsoon. Now, there are some spatial characteristics also. Now, when we talk about the spatial characteristic of monsoon, we have to mention that monsoon rainfall is not same all throughout India. Now, you will identify on a map, see these are the particular areas, specifically northeastern parts of India, western coast of India, in which we have higher amount of rainfall, which is a result of monsoon period, right? And in the western and northwestern part of India, we have lower amounts of rainfall, right? So the spatial distribution of monsoonal rainfall is not same, right? So that is one spatial characteristic or spatial variation which we have to mention. Clear? So these are some important points which you can highlight when you are identifying the characteristic of Indian monsoon. Now, there are some basic characteristics as well which you would like to mention. That could be reversal of winds. You can say that there is seasonal reversal of wind. So that can also be a characteristic of monsoon. Then you can also say there are distinct wet and dry season. Fine, this is also one characteristic of monsoon. Wet season is generally summer, dry season is generally winter period. You can also say that the characteristic of monsoon type of climate is what? There is sufficient amount of rainfall. Fine, amount of rainfall is sufficient but within a very short window, right? There is only a window of, let's say, 4 months. Within that 4 months we have a sufficient amount of rainfall, and this particular water is going to last for us throughout the season or throughout the year. So these are some general characteristics which most of you are going to write, right? So what I am trying to tell in this particular session, that whenever it comes to characteristic or writing characteristic of monsoon type of climate, please write these general characteristic, but also have this type of classification or this type of categorization where you will mention temporal characteristic as well as spatial characteristic of monsoon. So that was about this particular question. The body part, you can also draw one map. Now in the map part you will show the southwest monsoon, you can also show the northeast monsoon. Additionally, you can also provide the distribution of precipitation or rainfall in this particular part. That is also appreciated. So whatever quickly you can draw all these things. You can also mention date here, that there is 1st of June by which monsoon reaches this particular part. You can say by 15th of July or mid of July monsoon is reaching here, and by 17th of September monsoon is exiting from this particular part, right? So these are some details you are likely to mention on the map. Finally, with conclusion, you will say what are the effects of this characteristic. Whatever characteristic or variation we find in monsoon, you have to provide its effect on India or Indian economy, let us say, or agriculture, or since this particular question is asking about Asia, you can just modify your answer and say whatever effect we have on Asia, that can also be mentioned in this particular part. Fine. So that was about this question where we have discussed the characteristics of Indian monsoon or characteristics of monsoon type of climate. So see you again in next session.